So maybe is anyone very yeah, exactly. If you those missing actually, but I don't know why they online. So I asked her. Yeah. Ah, this one is also actually I have, but I don't know which one. We have it's just visible to everyone. Are you going to like kind of share? I think it's I mean I have yeah, yeah. And there's also this. You're gonna start like Okay, we can just change the screen. I think it should be somewhere. I think but I don't know how can I check it? Well, I think it will like pop out. If there's a question, maybe you can just click. Yeah, I can come back. You can do presentation, there's really no question. Yeah. I should be stuck. Yeah, this is next right now. So, yeah.
Very nice and outside. To the session of agroecology drivers of adoption, impact of practices and lessons learned. I think due to the limited time, I think we're just going to start directly with our first presenter, Da, and with the title Co-creation of agroecological practices, combinations in agroecology living labs. We have about like 10 minutes for the presentation. I'll maybe give you a little time, kind of the 10 minutes are slowly over. Then we also have time for a few questions, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, and welcome everyone. Yeah, the title of the presentation is Co-Creation of Agroecological Practices, Combination in Agroecology Living Labs. The buzzwords in the titles, you are familiar with that, and you're talking about that so much in your circle, so I won't go into that. Today, I'm giving this talk on behalf of a colleague, Diego Erudo, for some reasons could not join today. So I'm a co-author, and my background is social science in agriculture. So on the agronomic questions specifically, I will direct you to share the email. So agroecology is a potential pathway to increase productivity and resilience in the humid tropics of Central and Eastern Africa. This is productive, it applies to most areas. However, what we're missing are tailored agroecological practices that are co-designed and co-tested, and practices which actually show evidence of performance. It is in this reason, or with this knowledge gap, that the Canals project started off with the goal to drive agroecological transition in the humid tropics of Central and Eastern Africa through 8 multi-actor transdisciplinary agroecological living labs. A few words on Canals. So it's a horizontal EU framework project that was funded under the Research and Innovation Action section. It has altogether 16 partners and 2 associate partners in 13 countries. 7 of these countries, some of the countries are from Africa, from Europe, and the countries of implementation are Cameroon, DRC, Burundi, and Rwanda. So the project focuses on the agroecological living labs. What is an agroecological living labs? In the Canals, we see agroecological living lab as a place-based experimental site where combination of agroecology practices are co-created using multi-method approach, facilitated by multi-stakeholders to address complex challenges faced by end users in real-life settings. So our living lab has key components, and the components include co-creation, active user involvement, multi-method approach, real-life setting, multi-stakeholder perception. This presentation today, I will focus a little bit on the co-creation component. So co-creation of agroecological practices is a participatory and a collaborative development of agroecological practices aimed at addressing the main challenges faced in the focus crops. For the context, for the case of Canals, we had the key considerations for designing the agroecological practices for the project. So we said there should be a consideration of the platform, or the platform for the project should survive beyond the life of the project in order to have actually a lasting impact. That the energy and the commitment needed from the stakeholders acting in the process, it should actually be high. We expect that it should be high as compared to linear agricultural extension approaches. We actually consider that the plurality of the process of co-creation should raise a game of interest among stakeholders, and strong facilitation capacity and support should be needed, or should be actually motivated. That the initiation of the co-creation design must be flexible enough to improve over time and respond to changes in the experimental or experimentation objectives. So the co-creation design in the Canals has actually 4 phases. The first phase is actually identification of the challenge and the definition of the objectives, the prototyping, the solutions and plan of the experimentations, evaluating the agroecological practices in the field, and actually checking the scaling and the scaling up process, and actually going to the next cycles. So it starts off with what is the problem, and then now the challenges for the problem is actually identified, then the how is answered, and then it's tested. For the first phase, which is the co-creation, the first step of the co-creation, which is actually the identification of the challenge and the definition of the objective, the researchers plus the core partners actually come together and they align their interests and their objectives. The second phase, which is the prototyping, we make use of field visits, expert consultations. And the third phase, we actually set up the trials and do data collections and report. And in the last phase, we actually go into the scaling part. So far in the project, which is the project has gone through so far only the first and the second phases, where the first phase workshops have been held in Kabari, in DRC, in Bujumbura, in Burundi, in Kamonyi, Rwanda, in Twi in Cameroon, Uvira in DRC, and Biega in DRC so far. So this is implementation of the first experimental phase is actually going on so far. So the first results across the living labs in Twi, for instance, Cameroon, the focus crop there is cocoa. And the main challenge which has been identified through the co-creation process has been the problem of pests, soil fertility, and shade management. And through the joint interaction of the stakeholders in this workshop, the combinations of agroecological practices which were co-created, the biopesticides, foliar fertilizers, improved shade management. For the case of Kamonyi, the focus is on the cassava. And the challenge identified actually the soil erosion and the low soil fertility. So based on this challenge, the agroecological practices which have been co-created or co-agreed upon there are kind of anti-erosion practices, combination of organic and inorganic fertilizers, and intercropping. While for Bujumbura, the focus is maize-based intercropping. And the challenges there have been pests as well as soil fertility management. And the agreed upon agroecological practices, biopesticides, and combination of organic fertilizers. Then you have a Biega, which is the focus there is in coffee, the coffee crop. Challenge there is low soil fertility, old variety, and pests. And then both for Biega and Kabare, the solutions or the agroecological practices which are actually co-created are biopesticides, anti-erosion practices, organic fertilizers, cover crops. And then I quickly come to the last one. In Uvira, the focus crop is rice and cassava. And the challenges there, you have pests, low soil fertility, and then you have now let me see, the other one is hiding. Then you have the practices there, which are co-created, are biopesticides, combination of organic and inorganic fertilizers. That was a long list. Yeah, so you have 7 on-farm experiments actually have started this year, 2024. And the designs include RCBD, split plot, stepwise approach, short and long-term trials. So the indicators which the focus is to measure here are productivity, economic and soil impacts, environmental impacts and sustainability of the practices, adoption potential and barriers, and short and mid-term. I'm rushing, but we could come to that. These are the few observations or learnings which have actually emerged now from the preliminary work which have gone so far in the first phases. It is observed, it's too early to say, that stakeholders show high interest in agroecology and have active participation in the co-created practices. That the bottom-up approach in co-creation brought new ideas and concepts. That each agroecological living lab is unique, and therefore the co-creation process and the design, implementation, and evaluation of agroecological practices must be adapted accordingly. And that severe cycles of co-creation may be needed to change at scale. That is, if the agroecological living labs must survive the project, beyond the project, which is the objective of CANAS. The co-creation process is demanding in resources and might fit into specific conditions. For instance, in situation where you have a strong commitment from key partners and stakeholders, where agroecology research problems are complex and need a co-creation approach, and where long-term platform for sustainability exists. So in this case, there's hope that actually what is initiated through the Living Labs will go beyond the project. That's the brief of it. Thank you so much. And for specific agronomic questions, I will actually invite you to contact Diego. I have here a flyer of the project. And if you're interested, you pass and you pick one where you see the website and the social media channels, and you get more information. Equally, not on the co-creation process, on the other activities which we are actually involved with in the project. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tim, and also to sticking to the time. So we have time for some questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Heisen, for the presentation. Could you go back to the second bulletin? You mentioned that the co-creation process brought about new ideas and insights. Can you be more specific on that? What these new ideas were? Also, what would be your ideas how to ensure that the Living Labs survive the project?
Yeah. In the project, there's a work package on with a specific objective of designing the Living Labs, the project, and designing the methodology for this, for all the co-creation. What I assume there, because I can only assume because I'm presenting for Diego, is that most of the agroecological practices in these Living Lab areas, some of the practices are old practices, not completely new. But starting from the challenge in the specific region, together with all the partners involved, researchers and practitioners, identifying the challenge and together proposing solutions to how this challenge could be best addressed through newly suggested agroecological practices. I think that's where the new ideas come in there. Because there are ideas from the practitioners, ideas from research, ideas from policymakers in this discussion, which are then brought together based on the challenge which have been identified. And then now a decision is made that for this challenge to be overcome, these are the possible agroecological practices that should be put in question, to be put in place before these are then tested. So the newness in ideas now is the generation of ideas from all the stakeholders involved based on the identified problem. That is how I see it. But maybe Diego could have said it differently. The second one, again.
How does the project assure, or what does the project do to facilitate that the Living Lab can survive beyond the project duration?
Yeah, that's a real challenging question. Starting from the beginning, there's a long process of identifying or selecting the stakeholders to be part of the Living Lab. Yes, part of the Living Lab. And a lot of factors have been taken into consideration, especially based on the willingness and the motivation to change something in the specific region. So it's assumed that with the voluntary engagement from the start, based on the wish to change the context based on the problem, we hope that even at the end of the project, that these people who have this strong drive to move agroecology into reason to actually advance the transition will then stay on working together. Because if they succeed in actually doing something together, they might want to do more because they have a vested interest in their specific agroecological, in their specific regions which they're working on. And that's our hope for the project, that the Living Labs and other practices that will survive the project, go beyond the project.
One other question? Yeah.
From the provisions you proposed, I think of that most of your approaches or what you're proposing are based for the crops at the level of production. So do you plan to look across the whole value chain of the crops in the future, or how do you plan to incorporate all of that? Because production is just an aspect.
Yeah, it's true. The project as a short term, that's one thing. And there's so much discussion as to go into impact studies and so on. But other work packages in the project are looking at issues of economics, looking at adoption potential and others. You're checking to see the scaling up of those possibilities. But as to say more as to what happens in future, we were limited by the constraint of the project. Yeah. One can, well, at the end, one intend to do specifically what I will do in the project is to introduce practices or agroecological practices tested in those regions. I will have a methodology where we're going to go back to these particular farmers together with them in focus group discussion, discuss the likelihood of scaling, the likelihood of scaling of adoption. Yeah, so that's the most we can do. But but they will see what are the possibilities that this will scale up in the future, and they will further identify the limitations, and then we'll see what kind of recommendation we can make.
Slowly move to the next, and I think in the end we will hopefully have some time left. Like there is a little buffer. We started a bit late, but I think there should be more time for discussions. Thanks a lot. Another applause. Our next presenter, Beatriz Arroyo, she joins from online. Beatriz, are you with us?
Yes, I'm with you. Good evening. I guess that I'll be presenting, sharing my screen. Okay.
In the meantime, I can tell them that the title of our presentation, it's like measuring agroecology and its performance, generating evidence to scale up agroecological transitions. Yes, now we see your presentations. The floor is Beatriz.
Thank you so much. So my name is Beatriz Arroyo from ICRAF Nairobi, and I'll be presenting on measuring agroecology and its performance. I hope I'm audible enough. Now, this is a collaborative project between 5 organizations and implemented in 4 countries, that is Benin, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Madagascar, and with an objective of providing evidence on the level of agroecological transitions, as well as the performance of agroecology with respect to different sustainability dimensions. Now, it's being implemented in the context of ProSoil project, which is being implemented by GIZ in 7 countries, and they have been implementing agroecological approaches since 2014. Now, the TEP tool developed by FAO, that is the tool for agroecology performance and evaluation, was applied in 839 households, approximately half of them being drawn from the ProSoil project sites, while the others being the comparison groups which have not been targeted for implementing the agroecological practices. To be able to effectively measure the implications of agroecology on soil health, we integrated the TEP tool with the soil sample analysis using the land degradation and surveillance framework developed by ICRAF. And this tool will be available for future TEP users. And finally, we conducted a participatory result validation with diverse stakeholders from different sectors. Now, our findings indicate that agroecology actually contributes to a more holistic food system. We found that there is still an opportunity to be able to drive further integration of agroecological elements and practices, because most of the farmers in the 4 countries were still at an incipient stage of transitioning to agroecology, as indicated by a mean chi-score of less than 60%. Now, chi-score, which is the characterization of agroecological transition, is a composite indicator that shows us the level of integrating the 10 elements of agroecology, as you can be able to see on the radar chart on the bottom right. Now, we found that there was a significant higher score that was scored by the ProSoil group. If you look at the bottom left graph, the ProSoil group had a higher score, a higher kite score across all the 10 elements of agroecology, with the greatest difference being on the co-creation and sharing of knowledge. And this simply indicates that this is a very important element when it comes to propelling agroecological transitions. We also found that the human and the social value had the strongest correlation with the KIAT score, and this simply indicates that agroecology impacts usually transcends beyond the environmental benefits, but also centering on the other social and economic elements. Our study provides great evidence that there is a very strong and positive correlation between agroecology and income as well as productivity. When we compare and correlate productivity with the 10 elements of agroecology, we find that agroecology does not just gain from elements that are related with agroecological farming practices, but also with the cultural, human, and the social value elements. And this simply means that it cuts across, it requires a systemic approach, and it is a very holistic approach when we talk about agroecology. We found that the more agroecological farms, those are the farms that had a higher degree of integrating agroecological elements and therefore having a higher kite score, were less exposed. The farmers from those sites were less exposed to toxic pesticides, and this is simply because they tend to rely on biopesticides. However, when we compare the entire inputs, including the organic fertilizers as well as labor, we find that the kite score was positively correlated with higher spending or expenditure on farm inputs. And this simply tells us that there is a need to be able to reduce the cost of agroecological farm inputs. Our study also indicates that integrating agroecology enhances the environmental factors, focusing on agrobiodiversity and soil health. This because we had a very strong and positive correlation between the KIAT score and agrobiodiversity as well as soil health, but only focusing on the biophysical soil health indicators that are implemented or rather included in TAPE. However, when we look at the narrow down to the soil samples that were taken to the lab, we find that majority of the farms were still acidic. They had a low level of soil organic carbon as well as total nitrogen. However, there was a positive correlation between the KIAT score, that is the level of agroecology integration, with soil organic carbon and total nitrogen, and this was particularly true at higher levels of agroecological integration. We found that ProSoil participants or participating farms had less acidic soils compared to the comparison group, despite the fact that there was no clear correlation between pH and the KIAT score. We also found that agroecology is very effective in advancing food and nutritional security, as farms with higher levels of agroecological transitions were found to be having more improved food security, increased dietary diversity, as well as reduced expenditure. We also found that secure tenure right is very critical in advancing agroecology due to the strong positive correlation between the two variables. However, there was we found that the legal recognition of land is usually lower among the females compared to the males. And this is a challenge that needs to be addressed in the 4 countries. Finally, we found that there was a positive correlation between the level of agroecology and the proportion of youth that are actually immigrating from agriculture. The more agroecological farm we have, the more the youth are going to look for other opportunity. It means that they are not so much interested in agroecology. And this is because of agroecology is a very labor-intensive approach, and it takes time to be able to realize the benefits for the youth, something that doesn't really go well with the youth. In conclusion, I'll give my key highlights. Number 1 is that for us to be able to have a holistic assessment of the contribution of agroecology on food system transformation, there is a need to adopt a more systemic approach. We also conclude that co-learning and sharing of knowledge is very vital in fostering agroecological transition. Our third highlight is that agroecology has multidimensional benefits, and this really proves against the common narrative that agroecology really focuses on environmental benefits and leaves out the other dimensions. We can also conclude that the deliberate propose that deliberate efforts are still needed to reduce the cost of agroecological farm inputs, and that since we found a variation between the two different approaches in assessing the contribution of agroecology to soil health, there is a need to be able to combine the farmer center assessment with the lab analysis for us to have a more comprehensive assessment and evaluation of soil health. And finally, is that greater focus is needed to re-engage the youth in agriculture. Number one, by aligning the long-term sustainability goal with the short-term benefits that the youth can be able to derive from agroecological practices, by adopting technologies that reduce labor burdens, and finally, enhancing access to tenure rights, particularly for the youth. And for that, I'd like to thank you so much for listening and open up the floor for any questions that might arise. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Beatrice, for this very comprehensive study. Are there any questions from the audience here? Yes.
Yeah, I would like to know, so far we have always heard, reduce the inputs that are used in conventional agriculture, reduce those inputs and use the locally available ones like compost, manure, do these methods with the, when the harvest has been happening, when you have the stubbles or you make a cover crop when the field is empty for some time, you mulch. There's a lot of those more natural ones that my question is, why are they so expensive? Yeah, we hear from Beatrice that they are that they are costly, that they have a high cost. So my question is why? What is the cost? Because we were assuming it is more expensive to buy from the agrochemicals that are available in the agro shops and so on.
Thank you very much for this interesting question. It came to us as a surprise, but we found an answer when we did the participatory analysis interpretation of the results. Now, when you consider the 4 countries, and when you consider the demand and the supply and the availability of organic resources, you find that most farmers, to be able to satisfy their large-scale farms, they have to actually depend on input suppliers. And when you consider the cost of organic inputs in these countries, the 4 countries, you'll find that they are significantly higher as compared to the alternative approaches, such as the conventional ones. And that is why we had a higher cost as represented in the results. The cost of organic inputs is usually significantly higher than the conventional ones, especially when it comes to things like fertilizers and labor. I hope I adequately responded to your question.
I think that, yeah, this was very good. Yeah.
Thank you, Beatrice, for the presentation. You mentioned that the cost of input is high, and the practice itself is labor intensive. So, in essence, you need to purchase labor, and yet you mentioned that it's profitable, it's increasing farm income. I'm wondering, are the products certified and fetching premium prices, or how is it then becoming profitable? Fetching income.
There's an echo in the room. I'd kindly request the organizers to repeat the questions if you don't mind.
Yeah, I also had some issues. Maybe can you speak up a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry.
Because I'm asking, how is it how is it that the practice is returning profit if the cost of income, of input, is high, it's labor intensive, which means that you have to pay for labor outside, right? I'm wondering, are the products certified and fetching premium prices in the market, or what's happening? You know, what's returning the profit?
Thank you so much. So what is actually making the cost expensive is that the suppliers have to, first of all, produce them. And agroecology is a labor-intensive approach. We tend to delink it with technology, and this ends up making it more labor-intensive. When the product finally reaches the market, we find that when we compare it to the conventional outputs or inputs rather, it tends to be more expensive. And remember, we rely on natural resources to be able to produce these inputs. When you look at the average number of livestock, for example, that people rear, it's usually a small number, either 1 or 2 or 3 cattle, which is not able to produce sufficient manure, and that increases the cost. Well, when it comes to a question that when the cost of input increases, why are we having a net positive income? Now, I think that was your question, right? Why are we having a net positive income when the inputs are high? Now, this is what I said. The higher the level of agroecological transition, the more the inputs and the higher the expenses. But when you consider the net income still, we still have a net positive income, which means that agroecology still contributes positively to the economic aspects, unlike the cases that it contributes positively to environmental factors at the expense of the economic benefits from the farmers. So the cost is high, but we still have a net positive income that we are realizing. This simply means that if at all the cost of inputs is reduced, then the marginal benefits is likely to be higher. So this is a possibility and an opportunity for us to be able to work on accessing the inputs at an affordable rate to be able to advance agroecology further.
Very short question.
Okay, very short one, because I think we slowly have to.
Just a question on the methodology. How much is the effort to do one take assessment per farm? Just in terms of hours or, yeah, in terms of hours. How long do you spend per farm to do a full take assessment?
There's an echo, but I understand you asked about the methodology that we used. We used the standard tape, but it was tailored to fit our local context. And number 2, we integrated it with a more robust soil analysis framework to be able to assess the contribution of agroecology to soil health in these 4 countries. So yes, we used the standard tape, but it was slightly tailored, and the new tailored aspect will be available for future tape users. So that is a plus contribution based on the project.
Yes, thank you. And the question was also like, what is an estimate of how long this analysis or survey took per farmer? Do you have maybe a rough?
Yes. Thank you so much. I was actually at the field. The approximate time was between 1 hour and 1 hour, 30 minutes. So the first interview that I conducted took 1 hour, 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
So it takes quite some time of the farmer, but it is bearable. Now, when you are applying tape in the field, it is very important for you to have all the questions in your mind so that you know what you are asking, you are going to ask. We found it more beneficial because you could find one answer in more than one response in one question. So when you are well trained and you know how to administer the questionnaire, there's a possibility to be able to take less time. But again, the more time you take in administering more questionnaires, the less time you take in doing so.
Okay, thanks a lot, Beatrice. I think we have to continue just due to timing. I will welcome Dorcas and Inga Alame for the next presentation with the title Ex-ante Evaluation of Integrated Soil Fertility Management as a Sustainable Intensification Practice, a probabilistic modeling approach.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, good evening, everyone. So I'm presenting today my work on behalf of myself and colleagues. Some of them are here. And I'm going to tell you about integrated soil fertility management. I'll call it ISFM from now on. So ISFM is the combination of mineral fertilizer, organic fertilizer, improved germplasm, and you have to tailor this to your soil fertility status, the economic profiles of the people that are going to use it, and of course to some agricultural practices that are related to where you're working. So ISFM is a very complex practice. And of course, when you add it again to, for example, in the global south, it's a very complex, we have very complex agricultural systems in the global south, but now you have to find methods to quantify the impact of such practices when you are doing it in complex agricultural systems. And then another complex aspect of this, when you have intersectionality. Here we have men and women, but it doesn't get only to that because it's more complex than just gender, women and men. Now I'm going to tell you about a method. You're going to learn a lot. It's amazing. And this method will reveal the at-risk users when you are trying to simulate or forecast the impact of an innovation. So pay attention to what you are going to talk about now. When we are simulating an agricultural system, I am an agronomist by training. So I will just go and get the biophysical part of the system. I get my soil samples, I get the plant growth data, and then I would say, this practice is good because I'm getting high yield. And then another group will work in their silo, and then they do the environmental part, the social part, cultural and economics part. And then in the end, we try to make those pieces fit together. Sometimes they will rarely fit and will not be able to get a clear image of how the system is functioning. And at this point, you might just be giving a wrong recommendation to somebody who is trying to decide on whether to do the innovation. And this is because there are so many random effects that we do not really account for most times when we are trying to simulate the impacts of innovations. In practice, for example, if we look at this barrel, we are trying to simulate ISFM. Normally, we'll just go and start collecting soil samples. We spend a lot of money on that, but maybe that's not going to really give us information about what we need to do because there's that information already. But here, where the barrel is leaking is on markets. And most times we might not even go and check the market because we don't even think that's where the problem is. So now I'm going to introduce a method that will help you to account for such things that we rarely think of when you're trying to simulate the impacts of innovation. And this method is probabilistic and it's highly participatory because when we start, we bring all the stakeholders together. We identify the innovation and we work together in a participatory manner so that we are able to develop a causal impact pathway that links the costs, the benefits, and the risks, those random factors that I talked about. We put them in a model that links everything that is anything that is affecting anything in the model. And then when we have this, it's like balls and arrows. We have to now translate it into a mathematical model, and we have a package that can run that and give you some kind of simulation of how much you are going to gain from the innovation. So you get to a point where you have to decide if you have variables with high information, you have to find what those variables are. When you find them, this is where now you have to go and invest your money. You measure what those variables are. In the case of the barrel, you go and find the information about the market on ISFM. When you find it, you go back to your model, you refine it, you cycle through this once again, you go back to the impact pathway and the mathematical model until you get to a point where you are satisfied that you don't have variables with high information, and then you can make, you can advise a farmer who is trying to do ISFM, for example, when you are sure that it's clear, so do ISFM. Now, we did this for integrated soil fertility management. I said that I was going to talk about the intersectionality. So we are going to start there. We tried to simulate the 5 years impact, farm level impacts of ISFM on maize and soybean rotation in northern Ghana. So ISFM has 5 components. And when you do ISFM, it's at the level when you're at number 5, when those 4 components are there. But most time farmers just do a few of them, but ISFM is really when you are doing number 5. So where our model, the model that I talked about, helps you to find the benefits. So here we have the farm profit and the social benefits. This social benefit has so many intangibles. Here we would think about some things that most of us would think you cannot measure it, but if it matters, there must be a way to measure it. So for example, trust. Farmers don't trust extension officers. So you might find a way to maybe measure that. What is trust in this model? So we have a way to do that. And then you get to the environmental benefits. This is very important too. And all that contributes to total benefits. So the total benefits will be discounted by the risks, those random effects. So we put them in the model. And of course, we discount them with the give us net present value, which will be discounted by the discount rates to give the present value. And now we know how it's affecting different groups. We look at how the net present value will be for the women and the men. Here I'm going to give you a snapshot of how the 5 components of ISFM performed for the women and the men. We could see that ISFM is doing quite well for the men on all components compared to the women. And if we focus on the most performing component, which was component 5 of ISFM, we could see that men are getting around 40,000 US dollars in 5 years. But for the women, they are getting around 30,000 US dollars in 5 years. This is good for the men, but the women are suffering, but they're investing the same amount of money compared to the men. So this is like the full ISFM, but I want to break it down on how we got to this point. So we looked at the farm profit, the 5 components of ISFM. The full ISFM is giving much more benefits compared to the rest, but you cannot just limit yourself to the farm profits because there are environmental benefits and social benefits that are part of the system. So the environmental benefits, when you are doing crops alone, no fertilizer, there is no environmental benefit, and that's understandable. So the more you increase ISFM components, the more environmental benefits you get. So all these, the farm profits, social benefits, when you combine them together, you still get the same result. But this is basically what we know. But the gap that we are trying to fill here is the gender part. If we are just, people that are trying to decide on whether to do ISFM, we could just limit ourselves here. Component 5 is doing well. It's 6,000 euros, so farmers should do it. But you are only deciding for the men, and the women are left behind. So we need now to find the complementary innovations that would make the women benefit the same way men would get the 6,000 euros. And that's the next step of action. Of course, we are also going to do some post hoc analysis here to give us some more information on the cash flows, the variables with high information, and we'll be able to decide what's the best course of action. So as I said, I promised you that I would I tell you how agricultural systems are complex. You have to know, go back with that home when you are doing assessing the impact of innovations. You have to know you cannot just focus on the biophysical part. You also need to use a probabilistic approach like the one I introduced today. It's highly flexible. You can use it in any kind of innovation, and there is a a method that we have for this that you can adapt to your innovation. And women and men do not benefit equally when implementing ISFM as the core innovation. So it's very important that we find the complementary innovation for the women who are the risk users for ISFM. Thank you very much for listening.
For this very interesting presentation on this magical model. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you, Lucas. It sounds really nice, you know? A good story. I'm wondering, how long will it, can you suggest how long it might take for this cycle to go around until you have something to recommend? You have an idea?
Yes. One thing that I didn't mention, this method, the advantage with it is that it's fast and it's very inexpensive. It's very cost effective. So if you have an innovation, before you go to the field and start investing money, we can have a model. If you are very fast, maybe in a month, you have all the details that you can get in the field. And we use expert knowledge. We only don't focus on empirical data. So if you're an expert on ISFM, you can give me information and I can run the model. So it's fast.
Yes, so my understanding, the case of modern data you mentioned, you see how to test this.
I need to just confirm some of the things because now I have literature and survey data. Now I have to go to the experts to see if there's any deviation in what I have. And yeah, it can just help me to decide.
Yeah, I think you were first. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And I want to ask a question about the social education. How do you quantify like the qualitative indicator, like you give the example of trust? I don't know how you quantify this, how you can measure it and fit it to your model.
Okay, so there is a method, I would say, that we were inspired by somebody who wrote a book called To Measure Intangibles. Trust is an intangible. So if that trust matters, so there must be a way to measure it. So when you say trust, you have to define what is trust to you. I was telling somebody, they said happiness is, for them, happiness is 100 euros. So the value of happiness is 100 euros. So if trust, for example, is, let's say, some kind of proxies to you, and that's the value that we must use for that social intangible variable. Yeah. Are you satisfied with the answer?
So it's like more subjective, and it goes from one to another person. This could be different value, and then I don't know how this can like have an impact on the model.
Yes. So it's context specific. In my case, I'm working in Northern Ghana. So maybe trust will be different to someone here and then Northern Ghana. So yeah, right.
Short question. How much can you trust the model?
Very much. I can trust it because it's not giving me one value. It has a distribution. So we don't work with precise numbers. So it can go within the distribution that you have anywhere within it. So I can trust it.
But it's still it can be a broad range, and have any kind of validator or control village or households, because one of the challenges of models is that sometimes they don't behave the way that we want them to behave. Yeah, and one classical way of making sure that the model can predict something is like looking into the past or having kind of independent samples. Do you have any in this direction?
Like to compare in real situation, real world situation.
Yeah, like you have a data set and then you take 70% to parameterize and then 30% of the data set you test to see if the model depicts the reality.
Maybe that's something we should consider in the future.
Okay, I think I'm gonna close here this discussion. I see so many hands and I think we could go on, but please approach Dorcas later and you can continue.
This is how you can find me if you have questions.
Thanks again, and an applause for Dorcas, but also for him. And we will continue with an online speaker. Sorry if we pronounce your name. Are you here with us?
Yes, yes. Am I audible?
You can share your presentation from your end.
Okay.
I think.
Yes. You can share the presentation. In the meantime, I'm gonna tell the title of the presentation, Exploring the Impacts of Drivers of Agroecological Intervention on Managing Resource, Case of Vegetable Production System in Ethiopia. I think.
Good evening. Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Nakacho Zode. I work for World Vegetable Center based in Addis Ababa. I will be sharing with you some of our experiences and practices related to agroecological interventions. Just as the title says, the objective is to share some stories about drivers and impacts of agroecological interventions.
Maybe
to give you some.
Could you make the presentation mode, please?
All right.
Yes, perfect. Thanks a lot. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, thank you. So to give you some background, this study has been conducted in central Ethiopian highlands. Those areas are characterized by, cultivation for more than 200 years. There has been a huge amount of soil degradation, and the land is becoming not supportive of crop production. So farmers are, applying fertilizer, too much of fertilizer, too much of pesticide to cope with the declining productivity, the declining yield. This has resulted in, a lot of complication in terms of impact on environment, on impact on food security. So based on this, our organization initiated a project which is funded by IKEA Foundation, and it is implemented in Ethiopia and Kenya. The project applies different agroecological practices to deal with some of the challenge I have mentioned during the background session. So the intervention areas are in the Central Highlands. In 3 districts, we have around 2,500 beneficiaries or vegetable producing farmers. The vegetable sector was deliberately targeted because it enables us to target as many women and youth as possible because it requires a smaller area of land. And as part of the data collection, we have collected a huge amount of data for using randomized control trial and using tracking of the key performance indicators associated with agroecology. When we come to some of the key findings, farmers are a significant number of farmers, significant amount of farmers are adopting the soil health intervention, agroecological interventions, pest management interventions, as well as soil conservation practices, especially those practices which are cheaper to adopt and those technologies which are also impactful in terms of enhancing soil fertility. Yeah, when we come to some of the findings during the 4 year of implementation, the perception of farmers pertinent to agroecological practices, it has improved awareness as well as adoption, and also the area covered by at least 5 regenerative technologies have been, agroecological practices has been significantly improved during the project implementation period.
One moment. Now
sorry?
there be a technical issue. Could you maybe reshare your slides because we still only see the beginning?
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh. Now is it visible to you?
Now it changes. Okay.
Can you make it bigger, like presentation mode?
Like in the right
corner? Are we in the same page?
Now we are on the 7th.
Yeah, on the 7th page, yeah.
Great. Maybe.
Okay, so shall I proceed?
I think it doesn't work when you make it bigger, but we can continue like this.
Shall I proceed with the smaller version? Is
Maybe
that visible to audiences?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's continue like this.
Yeah.
Okay. So when we look at some of the determinants, most of the people who adopted these practices are, as I was saying before, they are women because they can be implemented at a small scale. As we know, women farmers as well as users, they have, limitation in terms of access to land. Awareness also, people with awareness regarding agroecological practices, they adopted a huge number of agroecological practices. Livestock ownership, as one of the presenters previously saying, those agroecological practices require ownership of livestock because they are prepared out of livestock byproducts. In addition to that, the effectiveness of those practices compared to the conventional inputs, especially vermicomposting, bioslurry, those technologies have a huge adoption rate because of their effectiveness compared to the chemical fertilizer and pesticide. Also related to this is access to extension services, access to coaching and mentoring services. They also affect the adoption rate of technologies. The adoption also, the area covered by at least 5 regenerative technologies during the 4 years of the project implementation enhanced a lot. We have also managed to increase the income of those adopters as well as the area covered with the agroecological practices. And when it comes to this, we have also tracking the soil fertility improvement during the project period. We have also witnessed improvement in soil organic matter and soil organic carbon during this short time period. We have seen some improvement in those soils which we have monitored during the project period. When we look at farmers' use of external inputs, those farmers who adopt more number of agroecological practices, they tend to use less external inputs such as chemical fertilizer, chemical pesticides. So it has a resource conserving positive impact. They also reduce the use of pesticide on vegetable production, which is a good thing, good for the people and good for the planet. On the other hand, we have also witnessed some yield penalty during the short term. Those farmers who adopt full agroecological practices, they experience some yield penalty, but those who adopt partial or some of the agroecological practices complemented with the conventional inputs, they have haven't experienced the yield penalty. So the negative side is a yield penalty in the short term. And when we conclude, there are different factors which affect the adoption of agroecological practices, especially the cost of adoption and the availability of those practices. Even if they are good, even if they are well accepted by farmers, some of the agroecological practices are not easy to access. And they are also quite labor intensive. They are not appealing to users and people who have less labor availability. They are also some of them are also skill intensive. One of the challenge we are also experiencing is that commodity products which are produced using conventional inputs and agroecological inputs, they are sold at the same price. So farmers are a bit discouraged. They are expecting some premium price for the yield penalties they have been experiencing during the adoption. The enabling environment, the institutional support system is also not as good as the conventional inputs. Governments, especially local governments, they prefer to use conventional inputs than regenerative or agroecological inputs because they are cheaper and easy to deal with in terms of logistics and in terms of cost. Yeah, in the interest of time, I will leave you here. If you have any question or points for clarification, I will leave you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very sorry for technical issues at the beginning. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes.
Thanks for the presentation. So you will find out that adoption of agricultural practices have impact on yield over time. But I'm curious, how much time is involved in the short term, long term, or long run? When will the farmer will actually have that impact on the yield? Because I think this will be very important for a farmer or someone who would like to adopt agricultural practices.
Thank you. Any question?
Sorry, I didn't hear it well. Can someone rephrase it, or can someone tell me? It was a bit far. It was not that audible to me.
So the question was about like the time scale. So how long does it take, like in terms of your project, for to see an impact on the yield, and like a positive impact from the time perspective?
Yeah, I think the project is a 5-year project. We are in the 4th year. We have seen some improvement in terms of yield, but the yield improvement is associated with, the improvement in soil fertility. So changing the soil organic matter, the physical-chemical property takes a while. Changing the soil takes a significant amount of time. It should take even sometimes it takes more than 10 years. So the one we show is a short-term impact. The medium-term impact, the long-term impact requires a lot of investment on the land, and we may not associate the current improvement only to the application of those agroecological inputs. It takes a while, at least 10 years and more than that. Improving the soil is a huge endeavor.
I think there is a follow-up, or?
Yeah, so in the short term, does it mean the farmer is not going to improve the yield? And if that is the case, we say it's not profitable for the farmer in the short term.
Were you able to hear the question?
I'm afraid I didn't.
I can repeat. Like the question was like on the short term, like what were the impacts on the short term, like the effects for the farmers? I think
In terms of profit.
In terms of profit, yeah.
Yeah, in terms of profit, one of the the advantage for farmers is to reduce the cost. So most of the farmers are almost withdrawing from the use of chemical inputs, chemical fertilizer, chemical pesticides, so that from the cost side, there is a significant reduction in cost. Also, there is the land, their land is improving in terms of, you know, some physical characteristics, in terms of the availability of worms, in terms of, you know, fertility. There is improvement, but reaching the full potential of the land, improving the soil fertility in a, you know, in a sufficient manner, it takes a while, but still in the short term, there is significant cost reduction. There is also yield improvement, but compared to the use of conventional inputs, still there is a slack, still there is a room for improvement, but still there is a yield enhancement compared to what it has been before the introduction of this project.
Thank you. Is there another question from the audience? Nothing. Then we continue due to time. Another applause to Edith Geo, and I will give the floor to Lauren. She has a presentation.
Can you please stop sharing the screen?
Her presentation is called Cultivating Change with Agroecology and Organic Agriculture in the Tropics, Bridging Science and Policy.
So, hello everyone. I hope you're all still awake and getting enough oxygen. Hopefully it helps that I'm here in person. Yeah, I think I can actually skip my presentation because I think we heard already some nice inputs from our colleagues about living labs for co-creation, about how agroecology can enhance productivity and profitability, and some ways to approach this in terms of modeling. But I will continue anyways, and I hope I can still add some interesting inputs that you haven't heard before. The title of my presentation is also the title of a recently published policy dossier that we put together at FEEBLE with some colleagues that aims to summarize the latest scientific evidence for policymakers involved in international cooperation in the global north and south. And it summarizes 88 scientific publications, including some reports. And ultimately, it has demonstrated that agroecology and organic can contribute to a transformation in production systems within the tropics. I have to tell you, I'm not a scientist. I have a master's in science, but my role at FEEBLE is a communicator. So I'm really taking the science and putting it in a way and communicating it in a way that's understandable for the stakeholder audience. In this instance, we simplified it quite a bit for the policymakers. So maybe it will be at a bit of a different level than all of you are used to hearing, but I hope it's still interesting. And I was also an editor of this publication. So despite technological advances, food systems are failing to meet the needs of society and the environment. This we all know. Here's some key statistics for you all. So 1 in 3 individuals worldwide are facing hunger or malnutrition. And if this current trend continues, it will increase to 1 in 2 individuals by 2030. The hidden costs that we see in the current agricultural systems add up to approximately 10% of global GDP. Thank you. And the food system is responsible for about 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. Oh, let me go back, sorry. These and other challenges are most evident in the tropics, and due to disproportionate food security, malnutrition, and impacts of climate change that pose significant threats. These are the big questions and kind of the red thread that will guide me through my presentation today. and the questions that we aim to address within the publication. So can agroecology and organic farming in the tropics feed a growing population? Are they profitable and affordable, and are they scalable? I'll dive first into feeding the growing population, and when we talk about feeding people, we all obviously need to talk about productivity, so that's what I start with. So research and practice has shown that active farm management is the key to exploit the benefits of agroecology and organic systems. Active, I put in finger quotes, agroecology and organic management can also be thought of as this systems approach that we take in science, this holistic view that we take of a system where we take this ecological thinking, where we think of the system as a unified whole. This is the, I don't know how to do the pointer, the green section on the right, depicted here in the illustration. And oftentimes when farmers and when we promote this other way of production, they shift away from this industrial management or conventional practices or business as usual by replacing inputs. So they're not actually changing their management or their approaches. They're taking kind of this middle orange section of non-active approaches in the middle here. And this can result in significant challenges and be quite frustrating for practitioners because they face decreased yields and pest and disease challenges as well as soil degradation. I want to dive a bit into a few case studies of how this active approach or systems approach, however you understand it best in your mind, can actually improve yields within the tropics. So potato cultivation in Kenya has been shown to increase organic yield development by shifting to these best practice systems. So we see in 2012 until 2015, this beginning few years, we see a significant difference between the yields until 2015. And in 2015, there were adaptations made to the system. So instead of replacing these conventional pesticides with store-bought biopesticides, there were really efficacy trials on biopesticides and botanicals, including optimal dosage applications, as well as integration of push-pull plants. So these are companion crops that have a pest repellent element to them. I'm sure you're all familiar with them, as well as improved compost management. And all of these best practices help to reduce the damage from pest and disease that was causing this big yield gap beforehand. Showing that yield gaps in organic systems or agroecological systems versus conventional can be closed with these active management approaches. Another example from the same project, I forgot to bring the project up, this system comparison project in 3 countries in the tropics. If you want to look into it, we can talk about it afterwards. And this is another example from the Bolivia trial, and this is looking at diverse cacao agroforestry systems, showing that higher total system productivity and resilience can be achieved with agroforestry. So up to 2 times higher yields can be produced in diversified systems, as well as improved household food security. And this really shows the potential to promote more diverse diets and increase the diversity of nutrients within local communities. It's an essential aspect in the discussion of whether agroecology and organic approaches are able to feed the world. I think we have to kind of think beyond this yield-focused paradigm to really look at all 6 dimensions of food security. And along with this thought, thinking beyond the yield. So do we actually need higher yields? And I think this is a question, a widely held assumption that needs to be looked at critically, because agricultural production, as we all know, has increased since the Green Revolution, and yet we're not feeding a growing population. So despite this increase in yield, the number of people suffering from food insecurity and malnutrition remains steady over the past 40 years. And estimates show that the growing future population can already be fed with the food that we produce today. And that's why it's very important to take this food system perspective to feeding the world. And that's something that we tried to highlight within this publication aimed at policymakers to address these different social, political, and economic challenges that need to be addressed first and foremost. And probably also interesting for all of you researchers, if the yield gap, or if yield in general, productivity is to be used as the primary measure to, for the prospects of agroecology and organic approaches, then I think the research and the structures that support it should be also critically looked at. For example, there exists some research discrepancies, so limited duration of research projects and trials, as well as a focus on the cash crops, so export crops, rather than the side crops, so to say, and as well as publication bias and possibly overestimation of this yield gap between conventional and other production systems. So one meta-analysis published that they found a bias that favored studies that which showed that conventional yields are higher than organic, suggesting that there could be an overestimation of this yield gap. Agroecology and organic approaches, for those who work in them, I guess are familiar with this, that it's difficult to find funding. And relative to the conventional funding, it's pretty menial. So I think this also needs to be always brought up again and again when the discussion between when the comparison comes up. Okay, I'm gonna try to speed up now because I think the time is running. So now we go into a bit more about profitability and affordability. This is again an example from the long-term system trial. This is comparing the 3 countries. On the left, you see India, in the middle, Bolivia, and Kenya. And when we look at the cash crops and the associated crops, so the non-export crops that are largely overlooked in previous study, it highlights that conventional and organic farming can be equally profitable when we consider these associated, the income that comes in from associated crops. And yields diversification allows more profitability than cash crop-based systems. Cash crops, yeah, the focus should shift, again, coming back to the last point of shifting this kind of focus from the cash crops and looking at the whole system yield. We should really try to consider the entire spectrum of crops that are produced within the farming system over time. Exactly, so now we're here. So the other important thing to consider in this discussion of profitability and affordability of agroecology is externalities. And this is something that came up, popped up in my mind earlier when a question was asked about how can it be that the inputs are expensive, the labor is expensive, but in the end, the profitability doesn't add up, right? And I think this is something we need to bring up. Another thing we kind of need to bring up again and again, that the externalities of this business as usual agriculture on the public, it's 10% of GDP. So although synthetic agrochemicals can increase the yield in the short term and they're much cheaper than organic biopesticides, they also lead to ecological degradation and negative health impacts on society and the environment over time. And this just, again, highlights the hidden costs. And the 10% is GDP it's the average for the whole world. But when we look at low income countries, it increases to 27%. So this is quite significant. And while the negative externalities are not included in, standard profitability calculations, neither are the benefits that agroecology and organic can provide to ecosystems and society. And here we can quickly go through them. I'm sure you're familiar with them all, but the approaches can provide better climate resistance and smaller carbon footprints. So globally, up to 2 to 4 times more energy efficient than conventional. Carbon stocks can be increased up to 3 times in diverse systems, for example, in agroforestry. And more biodiversity can be found on and off farms with healthier soils in agroecological and organic systems, with 30% higher species richness, as well as looking at the human health aspect of reducing the exposure to harmful agrochemicals. 95% of the people who suffer from pesticide poisoning each year live in the global south. So these dangerous synthetic pesticides are not allowed in organic and ideally not used in agroecological systems either. And now slowly coming to my last point, on my own time, I need to, about are they scalable? I think with what we've heard today and what we've looked, the evidence for agroecological and organic approaches show that they are adaptable to diverse agroclimatic conditions and contexts, and they can also be scalable solutions for various scales. Within the policy dossier, we highlight 11 opportunities, and they're here on your screen as an illustration. 11 opportunities to facilitate sustainable food systems. I'm not going to go into them in detail now because time does not allow, but I would like to say in relation to the scalability, the full benefits of these approaches oftentimes haven't been realized because of political and institutional barriers, and lock-ins. And I think that's why it's very important to create and write such publications that really try to summarize research and communicate them for these political actors to create the change that we want to see in the end. This one I have to skip because I don't have time. And yeah, please come to the front afterwards. You can scan the QR code if you're interested to read the document. You can also take a copy with you, a hard copy. And now I open it for questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. I think it was a nice kind of round-up presentation, also thinking a bit about how to translate our scientific evidence into nice text and visually nice illustrations for the policy audience. So I think it's always good to kind of reflect on that as well from Science Desk. Are there any questions? Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very nice presentation. I think we are going like all the same story. We know what to do, but we don't know how to do that. So and this is probably a good step that you summarize your achievements in science as a people, but how you want to translate it furthermore, not only the policymakers, what you expect the policymaker take from that and how it could be implemented by farmers, because all those practices are good. However, they're labor intensive. We don't know if the farmers have skills to do that. They are management intensive, as we heard in the plenary session. So where is the next step to really translate it to the farmers?
Yeah,
and how they can accept it?
It's a good question, and I think anybody in here could answer it just as well as I could. I mean, I open it to other people to speak up, but I can say, from our standpoint, this was really our aim, our goal with this publication, and pushing it to also to scientific audience, is to create an easy to understand, non-scientific language, evidence that there's science backing behind these approaches, And policymakers should take them seriously. And then in the end, unfortunately, I didn't have time to highlight these opportunities, but we offer some very general, so that they're adaptable to different countries, opportunities, or we call them recommendations really, of what policymakers can do within their country. So how those things are taken up is really up to, the level of government that these people are working at, and what's realistic within their context, right? So, and I think it's a nice moment to maybe say, we're happy to share this document as well, like in the editing form, and really if you want to adapt it for your country or use the information within it to make a specific publication for Kenya or for whichever context, we are more than happy to support in this realm. Yeah. Did you want to say something, Lillian?
This your publication really greatly shows one step forward, to show, okay, it's not just about organic or conventional agroecology, it's a step further, and you can have an increase in income by smartly really using all these different dimensions of agroecology. So it's not just about saying, okay, we compare agroecology in conventional, or we compare conventional and organic, but we really look into also how is agroecology done, and how is it smartly using ecosystem services, how is it integrated into the social cultural context, and I think this is a step forward to really look into making it more and more smart, more and more adapted to contexts, and really based on ecosystem services, so input costs, labor can be reduced.
Yeah. Thank you.
So next presentation. So when you compare diversification versus profitability, I expect you also touch something about the diversification risk management. For instance, crop failure. In most of Africa, in developing country, diversification, it means more like trying to reduce risk of one crop failure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you get something about that?
No, I think it was not integrated, but
I don't think within our research at FEEBLE, but it's something that we wrote about also within the policy dossier, that when you have, it's exactly like you say, when you have more crops, you have this kind of safety net, that if your maize crop is completely destroyed by pests, then you have at least your beans, or at least this, or at least maybe it's not your cash crop, maybe it's not your export crop. It will obviously have some sort of effect on your profitability, but at least you're not left completely. And this is also something that's been shown in the research, and I didn't highlight it in the presentation, but yes, yeah.
And how can you explain that? The more diverse farming systems is where there are more poor people. If diversification sometimes also mean increase of profitability or even productivity.
Can you formulate it as a question? Sorry.
The more diverse farming systems are where the most poor people are. Well, how can you explain that? For instance, let's go to Africa.
Yeah.
Sub-Saharan Africa. You get this book from this slide. I forgot his name, but we did the map of the farming system, especially in Africa, global farming system. And most of the diverse farming systems are in that area, and also in Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. And poverty are also there. How can you explain this? If diversification sometimes also means like increase productivity and profitability.
Maybe talking about diversification in very generally is maybe not the point. I think it's about finding which crops you can, use as your cash crop, create income for your farm so you can invest, etc. But also having the associated crops so you can bring them to the market and feed your family and all these things. So I don't know how to explain that diversity and poverty are somehow coupled.
What is system diversification?
Yeah, maybe what we can add is like this data about the diversification of Bolivia and agroforestry system. So it's maybe quite different from a context in an African country, and I think it's hard to just draw conclusions like this. But I think it's kind of a starting point also to collect more data like this, that we kind of start also kind of collect data on the side crops or diversifying crops. And this is exactly important in this context of a policy brief to also show a bit like, okay, we know the data, but or we know some facts, but it's not enough, and this is exactly the questions that will come up, right? So
we can also assume that in the global terms we have more commercialized farmers, so they who are not so diversified that as those in the global south who are more subsistence oriented, not diversified. Maybe that's why you see this difference in the diversification is higher in the global south because they are subsistence oriented, and they are not enjoying
Just a comment to add to the poverty thing. Farm class is much strongly correlated with poverty inversely than diversification. And the diversified cropping systems actually they cannot really be correlated with poverty or not, but as a kind of a buffer factor. They operate as a buffer factor. It will probably prevent you to go to the very highest levels. It might potentially prevent you to go to the lowest levels of poverty. But I would appreciate to see a nice data set of farms to prove this hypothesis.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think also the socioeconomic characteristics of the farmers come into play. Like in the global south, we're referring to Africa, the agriculture is like the main source of income, whereas in other settings it could be diversified. And yeah, so we need the socioeconomic characteristics come into play. You have to link poverty with diversification.
Yeah, are you talking about what farm diversification?
Yeah, also diversification and of course insurance.
Hey, I think you want to add.
Thank you for your.
After the session, and you can just come to learn and discuss further, because I feel a little pressure to close the session. Thanks a lot for joining and engaging, and a big applause to all the 5 presenters again. Knows this session was hosted, and we have in November an open people day where we're going to share a bit more on research, organic farming. So you're all invited to join. It's like a free open day. So if you're interested, you can scan the QR code just for some advertising.